Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. Maura Moynihan has devoted herself to the Free Tibet and anti-CCP movement for nearly half a century. Today, we are going to learn more about her life and her work. Hello, Maura. Hello.
你好.
你好. 你好.
Thank you so much. 谢谢 for the
Thank you. Thank you, Maura. So, bear in mind your background. You apparently have chosen a difficult path and have given up a lot. How did it all begin?
It began for me when I was 15 years old, when my father, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was appointed ambassador to India by Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon. And we moved to India in January of 1973. And I was the new kid in the international school, and I wanted to make friends. And I was invited on the school class trip to Kulu Manali, which is by the Tibetan border in northern India. So we got into these vans and we drove north, and I saw all these Tibetan road workers building, which is now the Kangra Highway. And I said to my Indian host, what are all these Tibetans doing here? And they said, China has invaded their country and they've taken flight to India like His Holiness Dalai Lama. And I could see these people were working very hard. They looked very, very frightened. It was only 11 years after the India-China War. I call it the India-China-Tibet War of 1962. And so we get to Kulu Manali. It is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And this magnificent valley, and you can see the Himalayas. And then we went to the Rotang Pass. The Rotang Pass was one of the oldest passes that linked India and Tibet for centuries. Tibetans would come down and they would trade salt. It was the old salt trade for silks and spices. And they would, this went on for many, many centuries until 1959, with the escape of the Dalai Lama. Then all of these passes were closed, sealed tight, and it cut Tibet off from the rest of the world. And when we went to the Rotang Pass, I could see People's Liberation Army soldiers with guns, with the red star on their green caps. They looked very frightened. And further down, there were Indian soldiers as well. And I saw barbed wire. And then there was a Tibetan with our group who said, now you've seen it, now we have to go. But that never escaped my mind. But what's going on here? How come we don't know about this? The Cold War was going on. And information didn't move as quickly as it does now. But still, this is very significant that Tibet has been occupied by China. How come there's a news blackout about this? So there were several Tibetans in my school in New Delhi from whom I learned about the genocide inflicted on the Chinese people by the CCP, and that 6,000 monasteries were destroyed. They were looted of their gold and silver and artwork and then burnt to the ground. And monasteries were not just one building, they were like townships. The monasteries in Tibet were enormous. And so this was a terrible loss, not just to the Tibetan people, but to the world, for the cultural patrimony of the world. And then when we were leaving India in 1975, I had a very unusual experience. I don't know anyone who had an experience like this. My father was invited by George H.W. Bush, who was then liaison officer in what was then called Peking. And so we went first to Hong Kong. It was my first trip to Hong Kong, 1975. And I fell in love with Hong Kong then. And I remain in love with Hong Kong today. I'm wearing a Hong Kong dress and my Hong Kong earrings. You can see them, but they are from Hong Kong. Okay. So then we stayed in Hong Kong for a week, and then we took a train to what was called Canton. Then we took a plane to Peking, and we stayed with George and Barbara Bush. The Cultural Revolution was going on. It was towards the end of it, but the difference in the societies of India and China at that time was extraordinary. Because in India, you had a democracy, you had a free press, there was art, culture, religion, there were places of worship of all kinds. There was a bustling middle class, there was all kinds of shopping and opportunities, and people could speak their minds and people could vote. In China, there were none of those things. People looked frightened. In those days, the strict Mao era, everybody had to wear a Mao jacket. And it was color-coded according to your status in the society. And I did notice, however, our Chinese Communist Party hosts, the CCP, who gave us banquets every night, they wore silk Mao jackets. And they had fancy watches. And they had diamond rings. Very well appointed. And they were fat and they were well fed. But outside, people looked frightened. People looked hungry. I can remember seeing a long, long line around the People's Commune. People standing in the cold waiting for one bag of rice with their chit because there was no commerce. You know, there was no normal commerce of any kind. And I also noticed people looked frightened and they looked afraid. There were no places of worship. There were no stores. You had a sense that this was a vicious police state and you better not step out of line. And we had, every time we went, you know, to the Summer Palace and we drove around Beijing and saw the sights, we had a driver. And my father told my younger brother and I, he is CCP. He pretends he doesn't speak English, but I've been informed he speaks fluent English. So be very careful what you say in front of him. And so we used to sing Beach Boys songs, myself and my brother, to sort of provoke him, you know, Surfing USA, you know, things like that. T-Bird, the song. And at one point he couldn't take it anymore. He just started laughing. Just like he couldn't take it because it's like we're torturing him with these Beach Boys songs. So then we flew to Shanghai and from there we went to Tokyo. And when I arrived in Tokyo, I felt like I had come to another planet after being in communist China. And I felt such incredible sympathy for the people in China because they didn't have to live that way. How come in all these other countries in Asia, people had freedom of expression, freedom to practice their religion, to be artists, to be poets, and China, they didn't have any of these things. So then I get back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where my father was a professor at Harvard. And I was a freshman that year, 1975. And in my freshman Asian Studies seminar, I wrote a paper saying Tibet was an occupied country and China was a police state, a totalitarian communist dictatorship. Well, they tell you that, sir. They tell you that in the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. So, I mean, I wasn't saying anything that wasn't true, but my Harvard professor, an American, he flunked me. And I was not happy about that. So I went to his office hours and I said, why did you flunk me on my paper? He said, China is a socialist miracle. China is the future. Chairman Mao is like Jesus Christ. He used those words. It was shocking. And you're wrong. And I said, have you ever been to China? And he said, no. Then he starts to get angry. And I said, well, you know, I was just there. I was in China and I just was living, I just went to high school in India. So I think I have a pretty good sense of how China compares to other countries in Asia. And then he slammed the table and he pointed at me and said, it's going to be my job to destroy you.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and then he did make an effort to, you know, harass me and threaten me. And I didn't have his course the next semester, but every time I saw him on campus, he gave me a really mean look. Turns out he was trying to get a visa to study in China. And the only way you can do that is you never, never, never criticize the regime.
Wow.
So that's how I got started as a China watcher.
Did you ever expect your work for Free Tibet and Free China would take so long and be so difficult?
No, I didn't. That's a very, very good question. Because on one hand, being realistic, we were always a very small group of people, the Free Tibet campaigners. Very few Tibetans were able to escape from the CCP occupation of Tibet. Only about 250,000 Tibetans got out. And so there was very few Tibetans, and then there were very few of us who ever took the cause seriously and stayed with it. It was a very, very hard thing to do. It was very hard to get money. It was very hard to get interest. It was very hard to break through the wall of CCP propaganda. But I was very, very determined because I always knew that Tibet was the CCP's weak spot. And isn't it true in Kung Fu you should hit the enemy at the weak spot?
Yeah.
They become hysterical when you mention the Dalai Lama. My father had observed this on one of his trips to China, when he was a senator in the 80s. He went on a congressional delegation to China, and one of his staffers came with him. And in the meetings with the Chinese officials, he brought up Tibet and the Dalai Lama. Of course, he would. And the CCP officials slammed the desk and they started screaming, Tibet is part of China. The Dalai Lama is a killer and a murderer and a liar. And then they pointed at the Americans, go, you had slavery and Indian reservations, so you can't tell us what to do. And the other senators all sadly just kind of said, you're right. And they kind of very cowardly said, let's drop the topic. But my father didn't. He said, yes, we had slavery. Yes, we had Indian reservations, but we don't have them now, and we admit to it. And that was in the 19th century, and we've tried to progress as a nation. And just because we did it doesn't make it right for you to do it. And that stunned them. My father's aide said that stunned them. They just didn't know how to answer. Somebody actually talked back to them, because the CCP are bullies. As all of the Guo Library listeners know, they're bullies. So you got to stand up to a bully. So anyway, I was kind of hoping that there would be enough interest and enough support, that the movement would eventually lead to a transformation of the Chinese attitude towards Tibet and a loosening of the hard line of Tibet. But after Bill Clinton gave them permanent normal trading relations in 1994, when I got arrested in front of the Chinese embassy in Washington, well, that kind of killed it. I'd like to tell your viewers one more story. I went to Tibet right after I got arrested in front of the PRC embassy. In those days, the visa office was a different area from the embassy. So the day after I got arrested, I went in and I applied for a visa to China, and I got it. Then I flew to Kathmandu, and I paid a bribe to somebody under the table to get a Tibet permit in my passport. And then I flew to Lhasa from Kathmandu. So 2 months after my arrest, I was in Tibet. And there were pictures of the Dalai Lama everywhere. You could see His Holiness's picture in temples and in homes. Well, the next year I went back to Tibet again in 1995, and it was after most favored nation trading status for China, permanent normal trade relations had been established by Clinton, and all the Dalai Lama pictures were gone. And patriotic re-education had been intensified. And that's Maoist thought, Marxist thought. You have to read the little red book again and again and again. It drives people crazy. And I looked around and I took extensive photographs of these trips to just see how quickly in 1 year everything has changed. And that's when I knew, Bill Clinton, you're working for the CCP. Thanks a lot. So it's kind of, I persisted and I persisted all the way up until the about 7-8 years ago, when Tibetans started self-immolating. They would go in front of a PLA office or the PSB office, the Public Security Bureau, which is the CCP's Gestapo, the secret police, you know, the dreaded knock on the door at 3 in the morning, it's the PSB. And they would say, free Tibet, long live the Dalai Lama, pour kerosene on their bodies and light their bodies on fire, like the Vietnamese monks did in the Vietnam War. And almost 300 Tibetans have done this. And we were writing about it for Radio Free Asia, and it was just sort of breaking into the Western press a little bit, and people are beginning to feel this is sort of what is going on here. And if this doesn't make people wake up and understand what kind of regime the CCP is, what will? And all the self-immolators would leave testimonies. It was men, women, children, monks, old people. Everyone was doing it. Said, I will not denounce the Dalai Lama. I will not give up my Buddhist faith. I will not become a communist. I would rather die. I would rather die than become a communist, because many Tibetans have become communists, are members of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, they have to be to survive. But that sort of didn't really make people's minds change enough. And then trying to crack down even harder on Tibet after that. And that's when Chen Guangkuo, whom I have a picture of, I'll show you later, he, governor of Tibet, he really cracked down hard and expanded the concentration camps, expanded patriotic re-education. But, you know, then it was too late. The West had already decided it was going to side with the CCP over the Dalai Lama after Obama wouldn't meet the Dalai Lama in 2009. And Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of State, said, we will not allow things like Tibet and human rights to interfere with our close relationship with communist China. Those are her words exactly. You can find it in official memos. I have copies in my files. So and then I couldn't get any funding. I would go to all the humanitarian organizations, all of the news organizations, all of the refugee groups, you know, and they think that they're so liberal and they're so progressive and they get so exercised if somebody gets arrested in Ethiopia, or Freedom House listed the Congo as the most destructive and dangerous, evil government in the world. Well, the Congo in the middle of Africa is such a small, insignificant country that the Lonely Planet website tells you not even to bother to go there. But China, which has 1.4 billion people, which has a concentration camp system that would make a Nazi proud, no, 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 you can't criticize them. And to my face, all these Harvard, Princeton, Yale educated directors of these organizations said, we can't work with you, Ms. Moynihan. You're a Tibet person and our board members have interest in China. And again, if a bank told me that, I'd understand, but I wasn't asking a bank. I'm asking humanitarian organizations. And if a humanitarian organization won't work with the great Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the greatest Buddhist teacher of our time, the Dalai Lama, then you have to go, wow, Bill Clinton, you did a good job. So I kind of gave up until Hong Kong blew up last year. Then I thought there's hope. There's hope.
Okay. So tell us, what has driven you to carry on for nearly 5 decades?
My very strong belief that the CCP is a danger to the world.
Right.
That is the enemy of the Chinese people and the enemy of mankind. And that one day, if the West didn't contain China or isolate China like it did the Soviet Union, and they've done the opposite of what they did at the Soviet Union, the West has integrated communist China into the World Trade Organization, into all of our institutions, normalized the CCP, normalized torture, normalized concentration camps. And I knew, I had a strange vision, Ming. In 2013, I was in Kathmandu reporting on the self-immolations in Tibet. I was on the top of my hotel, the Hotel Tibet in Kathmandu, and you can see the edge of Tibet from the top of the hotel. You can see the snow mountains. And I'm not given to visions. I'm not a very good meditator. You know, I wish I was, but I'm not. I felt in this life, I have to be the rabble rouser freedom fighter. You know, maybe I can meditate in my next life if I have one. But, and I had this vision that, oh my God, the CCP is going to create a catastrophic global event. And then and only then will people turn to us Tibet people and go, oh my God, tell us what you know about the CCP. When it's too late. And sure enough, that's what's happened with the CCP virus, isn't it? So I kept going because I believed that this day would come. And I believed somebody had to defend His Holiness Dalai Lama. Someone had to stand for him. And I also believed that we were not helping the Chinese people by supporting the CCP. Doesn't anybody remember Tiananmen Square? Doesn't anybody remember Liu Xiaobo's writings and how he died in prison 3 years ago? He seems to have been forgotten, but not by me. I've painted several portraits of him. So I gave up also because I didn't give up because I was mad. I kept going, Ming, because I was mad. And I'm still mad.